Hello and welcome to GryphonArt, and today is really about expanding the potential of that drop-sided gift box that I showed you how to make last week. Now I do want you to be absolutely clear on what it is that this tutorial is actually covering today. So before we start getting creative, I'm going to go through that with you so that I'm not misleading you in any way and consequently wasting your time. So this is the end product that we will finish up with at the end of this tutorial, and we will have a look at that in more detail in a moment. But first of all, I just want to return to the gift box that we made last week. And I have made everything in the same colorway so that you can more readily see the component parts. So this is that drop-sided wine box, which simply, as the name would suggest, the sides just open and drop either side to reveal a small bottle of wine that equates to approximately a good sized glass. So that's the component. We are needing to start with one of these wine bottles if you want to make this particular box in its entirety. I'm hoping that you can now see the relationship between those two boxes there. So all we've then done to create this box is to add a small drawer style box, top and bottom. And although this box will stand on its own, you know, if you had a chain style bracelet or a pendant or a small gift of one sort or another, you could simply utilize this as a gift box on its own. But it has been specifically designed to be attached to this drop-sided gift box containing the bottle of wine so that you can personalize that gift of wine. Now before we have a look and I give you an idea as to what these little drawer sections might hold, I'm just going to quickly show you how this mechanism, this drop-sided mechanism, remains unchanged once we've added those additional boxes, top and bottom. And actually, you know, you can make a decision as to whether you just want to put a box on the top or on the bottom. You know, you don't have to add two boxes. It depends how you want to enhance that gift of wine. But I haven't got much room here, so I can't stand it up very easily. But if I can just show you, this still opens in the same way and drops down so that you've got your bottle of wine in the center. It just means that your wine is standing a little higher because it's on this little plinth. Let's just take that out because it might be easier to demonstrate. But the mechanism remains just the same. So I'm hoping that actually clarifies things a little for you. What we're actually going to do today is start with the original wine box, and I'm going to show you how to make this little drawer style box so that can, and also how to attach that to that original wine box. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, if you haven't already seen this tutorial for this drop-sided wine box, I will put a link for you in the description area of this video so that you can easily get to that if you want to make that drop-sided gift box, this one here, in its entirety. Right then, with that sorted, we can now get down to some crafts. Now the first thing I'm going to look at are actually these sections here that will end up dividing our drawer section from our actual original wine box. And the reason I'm doing this is really because they need time to dry out. So if we sort them out to begin with, by the time we need them, they should be nicely dried out for us. So actually, I don't need my scoring board for that at this point. Now I have just die cut some 2.5 inch squares using a Spellbinders Nestabilities classic squares large die cutter, but I'll put the information regarding any die cuts that I'm going to use in the description area for you, so you'll have reference to that. And what I'm going to do is actually layer these up, because individually this card that I'm using, which is about 290 grams weight, so I think in the US that's about £140 or slightly less than that, but it's actually reasonably flimsy even at that weight, and I don't want the corners of my box to become damaged, you know, if they're lightly knocked. So I want something of sturdier construction. So I've made the decision to layer up actually 3 of these with this weight card, and you know, that may vary depending on the thickness of card that you're using. So you will need to make that decision for yourself. You know, if it's thinner card than this, you might want to do 4 layers, or you know, if you're using thicker card, you know, you may feel that you'll get away with less. So the first thing I'm going to do is layer those up. So let's have a look at how we go about that. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you will know that I like to use a combination of double-sided tape and PVA glue, because I like the immediate adhesion of the double-sided tape, but I also like the long-term strength of the PVA glue. So, you know, I just tend to use the combination of both. So I'm just applying a few pieces of double-sided tape in the first instance. And then all I'm going to do, just make sure I've got the right side of that. So I'm just going to put some glue on here. And with these shapes, the most important thing for me is to get around the sides of them, because, you know, I'm trying to create a lamination of these pieces of card. And, you know, if they're not sticking around the sides, then there will be gap showing, and it, you know, won't look quite as aesthetically pleasing. So I do want to get a bond around those edges. So get rid of that glue. Just take the backing tape off the double-sided tape. And then it's just simply a case of layering these, lining everything up. And it's worth taking a little bit of care doing this, because, you know, if you can achieve the look of a single shape so that, you know, they're not overlapping at all, it is a better effect. So this is what you don't want. You don't want this separating here, really. It looks better if it's closed up. So we'll just take our bone folder at this point and apply some pressure around all sides of that shape. And the PVA glue does take a little while to go off. So I'm just going to get rid of that little bit of excess where it's oozed out. You can see again that's popped apart, and that's simply because you haven't got that instant grab of PVA. So you just need to continue to work around. Just be careful that you're not dragging the right side of your shape into glue that's oozed out. So I'm just going to keep working that. And checking those sides. Once more for good measure. And at that stage, I tend to put that under a weight before I add my next layer, and continue to build up like that. Once this is dry, it's going to be a lot firmer. In fact, you can probably already see with just 2 layers that it's much firmer. And, you know, so if you let them dry out between adding the layers, you'll get a better idea as well as to how many layers you actually feel are necessary. So that I can put under a weight. Now I have actually already made up another one here which has got the 3 layers, so that one's ready to go. But you are going to need 2 of those, so this was 6 die cut squares in total for each of these drawers. So if you're making a drawer for the top and bottom of your wine box, you're going to need to start out with 12 squares. Now incidentally, if you are going to use just plain card because you haven't got an appropriate die cut shape, I've actually used die cut shape, so I know that they're all the same size. It would be very difficult for you to cut 2.5 inch squares that are exactly the same size. So in that scenario, it might be worth you gluing the layers of card together, and if you've got a scalpel blade, cut them in one hit, and that way you know that all your edges are going to be nicely lined up. Right, so we can now turn our attention to making our box components, and we're going to start with this little internal tray, and for that we're going to need the scoring board. I'll just pop that in place where you can see it. Now we are going to be using a piece of card for that tray that will be 6.5 inches by 6.25 inches, and we're going to start by scoring at 1 inch and 2 1/8 of an inch, and we're just going to repeat that on all 4 sides of our card to create the sides of our box. So just rotating the card 1 inch and 2 1/8 of an inch, 1 inch and 2 1/8 of an inch, and that's all of our score lines completed. So I'll fold and crease all of these off camera and come back to you thereafter. So I've now folded and creased all of those score lines, and in order to give myself the best chance of ending up with a square box, I've just made sure that all of these fold lines on one side of my card are lining up nicely and squarely with the fold lines on the other. And as long as you apply that principle, your box should end up being square. Now, the other thing you probably will have noticed is that I have started to cut away some of the excess card in order to form the box pattern. And just as an aside, I will include a diagram at the end of this video so that you can see the final box pattern, and that will help to refresh your memory a little. And I'll also, along with that, include a table of the card sizes that you require and an indication of score lines. So let's just see how we tackle these corners to form that shape. We're actually removing these 3 sections, so that either square or rectangular sections. And if you haven't seen me do this before, then I actually take this approach. I cut away down one side of the shape, including all the evidence of the fold line. So I'm cutting that away as well. And that's so that this fold line doesn't interfere with the angles on our boxes when we come to put it together. So, you know, it's a good habit to get into. So again, this square as well, including all evidence of that fold line. And just to demonstrate the reason for that a little further, these are going to be folded. These flaps, for example, are going to be folded and glued in that position. And if I had left that fold line on the edge here, it would overlap with this fold or crease line as well, and it would inhibit that edge from being formed. So, you know, that's the reason why you do that. That means that you're going to get a nice square finish on the inside of your tray rather than an angled one. But you know, if you're happy to angle it to avoid this problem, that's absolutely fine. It's, you know, it's personal choice. So the next thing I want to do is just to check, because this is almost square but not quite, so I want these flaps that form the box to support the edge of my box rather than the end. So let's have a look. So I actually want those flaps to rest inside this tray along the edges, not the end. So I know that that long edge is 2.1 inches long. So it's this edge that they want to come and line up against. Now, whenever you are deciding where you want those flaps to occur, you cut in between the two sections. So this will be my flap. I want them to line up here, so I cut between the two. And I'm actually cutting down that fold line, just to that intersecting fold line, just as far as that. And that's going to form my flap. So having made that decision, I want this one to fold against here. So I'm going to cut in between the two of them again. And that one folds that way. So I just then turn that shape around, that pattern around, and repeat the process on the other side. And that's now our tray pattern complete. We can now start looking to construct it. So whilst I was off camera, I did actually put some of my double-sided tape on, but I didn't put them on these flaps. So I'll just very quickly put a little bit of double-sided tape onto these corner flaps. So this is on the right side of my box for these corners, and the rest has gone on the inside of the box. So just a couple more. So the first thing I like to do is to sort out where these ends, where the flaps are not going to be underneath, so I can glue these two ends down. So I'll get one of those sorted now. Apply a little bit of PVA. It does get everywhere, I have to say, the PVA, but I'd rather that my box was strong. So we can do that to both ends, and I will just do this second one to save confusion. Ooh. So that's starting to form that box shape. So the next thing I need to do is pop these edges together. Now, you may already know, if you've been watching my other videos, you'll certainly know that I deal with these in pairs. And as always, I'll demonstrate why in a second. So just applying a little bit of PVA to those corners. And that double-sided tape is going to grab these little flaps immediately, so I won't have to worry about holding onto them until they've stuck down. You know, the double-sided tape will do that for me whilst the PVA is setting up. So it's just a question of bringing these flaps up, then making sure these both tucked in. It's a good habit to get into, and lining up these corners. And you can see that's grabbed immediately. So I can now put this down on this side and just apply some pressure with my bone folder or a similar tool. And that then means that I can also put this flap down. That's simply going to go in there. And I will repeat that process off camera at this end, but what I wanted to show you, why I deal with these in pairs, is because if I'd stuck that flap down and accidentally left this one out, you can see it's going to be a bit of a pain and a struggle to try and get that back in. So if you deal with them in pairs, you shouldn't ever encounter that problem. So I'll stick that down in the same way as I did, these flaps first, then this one, and then I'll come back to you at that point. So that's now our tray complete. Nice sturdy little tray because it's got these double thicknesses on the sides, and that means that we have a nice soft edge to this top as well. So, you know, that should slide in and out of our box sleeve fairly nicely. So for our sleeve, we're going to need a piece of card that is the same length as the box that we wanted to fit into. So in this case, it's going to be 2¼ inches, and I've left it over length. I've simply cut this 2¼ inch section off the top of a piece of A5, and you'll see why I've done that in a minute. We are going to be cutting some of this off because it's more than we need. Now, before we go ahead with the scoring of that, I am taking a different approach. I have found that the actual score lines vary. The thickness of this is going to vary in the sleeve depending on how thick the card is that you're using. So there's this variable, and actually you do want to make sure that the sleeve fits fairly well. You don't want this drawer to be too loose. For that reason, I take the stance with this style of box to fit the sleeve to the tray. And that's the approach that we're going to be taking. Now, in order to do that, it's simply a case of lining things up. So I'm going to line my piece of card up here, and just be aware that sometimes these edges can be slightly higher where they've been folded up. So, you know, you just need to line it up with the top sides of your box. And then once you've done that, square it with the top of your scoreboard. And I tend to just take a point. Actually, I'll move it along. I normally use the 4-inch mark, but I'll move it to the 6-inch mark, I think, so that you can see more easily. So I'm just going to then, knowing that that card is lined up with the top edge of my box, I'm then going to move this down to a point where I also know that it's lining up with a score line, and then I'm going to score accordingly. So I can see that's now on that 6-inch line. So I can score. And at that point, I'm going to fold and crease that score line. And I know that that now is a nice fit against my drawer. So with that in place, I'm just going to continue to repeat that process. So I can keep as long as I'm keeping the edge of this card square, then I can move it to a score line. You don't want it too tight. Unfortunately, this is trial and error. Your first one may not be absolutely spot on, but I would say, if anything, err on it being slightly looser than too tight. But you know, once you've done one, you'll have gained the knowledge of that. So I'm now going to make another score line there, because that's where it needs to fit. So I can now fold and again crease it. So it's just that process, walking through it until you've got a complete sleeve. So I can now fit that in, and I'm hoping that you can begin to see that there is a little bit of room in that, but it's sliding quite nicely. So again, and at this point I sometimes turn this over because I can sit that slightly down in that sleeve so that I know that these top edges are not popping below that card point. So I'd like to have it slightly down. Again, keep lining it up. And once you're happy with the position, you can score again. So I'm going to continue in that process until I reach the end, and then I can show you, how we finish that off. So I've now completed all of those score lines, and I've folded and creased them, and I hope you can see that that drawer now is a really lovely fit. It's working very well, and I have to say I've tried other methods, and although it takes a little bit longer by doing each score line individually, this works for me, and I'm hoping that you find it works for you too. So as you can see here, I've got this little flap that I don't need. So the first thing I've done, I've put a piece of double-sided tape on there because I know that that's going to be sitting at the top of my box, because I want this edge to be down at the bottom. It's less visible there. So, if I cut this off, I might get a bit confused as to which way around this is going. So I put my tape on there. That indicates that that's going to be glued to this other flap. So what I'll do then, I'm going to cut away this section here that's not needed, along with all of the evidence of that fold line. And then I'm going to put a piece of double-sided tape on the inside, and then I'm completely aware of how that's going to go together, and I won't be making any mistakes in that respect. Now, before we put this together, there is one more thing that we need to do. So I've just already put that in the wrong way. It needs to be that way, doesn't it? See, I told you can get yourself in a muddle. So what we need to do, I like to put a stopper in this. And actually that brings me to something else I want to tell you. When you're doing this, if you're going to be putting a box on the bottom of this wine box, as in this case, you do want to make sure that you've got a fairly sturdy weight of card, because this is going to be taking the weight of that wine bottle. So, if your card is very thin, it may not be the best card for this particular scenario. You do want about a 290 GSM or 300 GSM card weight for this particular application. So just bear that in mind. It's taking a fair amount of weight, and even with those little sections that distribute that weight, it's still a lot of weight for that to take, and if the card's too thin, it's potentially going to squash that sandwich down, as it were, and then your drawer won't slide open very well. So that's just something else I need to mention, really. So we're going to put a stopper on this section of card here, and before we go ahead with that, I want to show you why. If I take this box of matches, which is a similar mechanism, that it's the drawer that maintains that shape. As soon as I take that drawer out, even though this is reasonably thick card, the whole structure collapses. So what we want to try and ensure, particularly for that box at the bottom of our wine bottle, we want to try and make sure that that drawer doesn't come out. We want to, prevent that if we can. So that's what the stopper is for. I can just show you on here, actually. It's not necessarily going to stay in there, that drawer, totally, that it's a compromise between the height of your stopper and the amount of space it's taking up inside your drawer. So if I was to really bend this, that drawer would still come out. But you know, if somebody's pulling that drawer out in a straight fashion, it will retain its position and retain the structural integrity of that box. So I'm just going to move this out of the way, and I've just got a scrap piece of paper here. It's just the length, and as long as this is wider, I want my stopper to be 1.5 inches wide. Now if I put that where you can see it on the 8-inch mark, this is just short of 2 inches wide, so I'll be trimming that back, but you know, it's wide enough so I can work with that. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'll just shift this over a bit now, is I'm going to score at 1/4 inch. And again, the number of folds you put in this depends on the thickness of your card. So again, that's a decision for you to make. So once I've put that in, I'm just going to fold that over and crease it. And then I'm going to be using the same technique that I used before. So I just need to line that card up nice and squarely against a groove on my scoreboard so that I can create a fold line against that folded edge. So it's just against that folded edge there. So now I can also fold and crease that one. So there we are, we're moving on. So then I can fold that over again and keep repeating that process until I feel that the stopper is deep enough to work and hold that drawer. So I will just quickly do, I know it takes a bit of time, but I've only got, I think, one more to go. So So that's actually quite a nice thickness, and I think that will do it. So with that sort of 290 gram weight, what have I got? I've folded it over, so there's going to be there's 4 retained score lines. I'm going to do one more, which will simply give me a place where I can cut my card. So, but as I say, you will judge the thickness for yourself. And you'll be able to work with that depending on how thick your card is. So I'll just crease that last one, and then I can use that as a guide for cutting it back. So I'll just cut away the fold line, and that should fit nicely. My bit of scrap. So the next thing I'm going to do is just pop this back to that 1.5 inch size that I wanted to achieve. So I'm going to simply score it now at 1.5 inches, and I can fold that, crease it, and again use that fold line for my cutting line. Rid of that rubbish, and now I can simply glue that in place like that, and so that's what I'm going to do next. I'm just going to use PVA in this case on its own. The excess off my fingers. I'll just fold all of that over. Just as a scoreboard actually. I can get that down on a good surface and use my bone folder to apply some pressure. Get rid of any excess that may be oozing out. And you can see, I hope, that that's quite a nice, reasonable thickness. That's going to create quite a nice stop for me. Right, so we can now bring back our box and our sleeve so that we can fit this stopper to it. And I do like to fit where this join is going into the box. Now, we can see if I place this, I've got my top section there where I need to, so I'm just going to do that double check that everything's in the right position. So that stopper needs to be on this section of card here. Flatten that out a little bit. So I'm going to put some PVA glue on this side where that join is. Not that anyone's particularly going to see it, but so that's there, and I'm now just going to line it up at the front of this section of sleeve here, fairly centrally. I will show you in a minute, closer to camera. So I've just positioned that so that it's slightly back from the front of the sleeve, which means that my drawer will fit in front of it, but and fairly centrally on either side as well. So we can now go ahead and fit our sleeve over that drawer, and I'm just going to do that with an overlapping section of PVA glue. Put some on that half. Take the box away for a minute. There we go. And as this glue has extended beyond the halfway point, I know that when these two come together they're going to overlap, so I will have had an area of adhesion that covers that whole side. So I'm just going to remove that backing tape. Now I can bring my box back in, and you can see that stopper is just going to slot in the front there. Just line up those sides. Sort of, you can check the fit as you go as well, that's fine. And I'll just use my bone folder to apply a little bit of pressure. So all we need to do now is to glue our sleeve to our two die cut shapes. So we're going to deal with just one section at a time, so I'll get rid of that. If you've cut and embossed, I've only cut my card, but if you've embossed, just make sure you're attaching, you know, the decorative side where you want it. So I'm going to deal with the base first, so I'm going to flip this over, and I'm simply going to apply some double-sided tape in the usual way. If I can find the end. There we go. So just a few pieces, so that it's really just for that instant grabbing benefit that this gives me. Otherwise I'd be having to hold things in place whilst my PVA went off. So that's our starting point. Now the first thing it might be worth doing is just putting that in place and doing a dry run so that you've got some idea of how much space. And because I've made these before, I know that on the sides I've got just under 1/4 of an inch, and I've got about 1/8 of an inch front and back, so that is going to help me, especially whilst I'm trying to do it over with the camera. So I'm now, having done that dry run, so I know roughly what margins I'm working with, I'll just apply some PVA, and then what I tend to do is I slide, whilst I'm dealing with one end, I slide my drawer forward so that I can get the glue to the very edges of the box, or the sleeve in this case. So, and then when I come to the other end, I just push it forward, and I can't push it quite as far forward because of that stopper, but it's enough so that the drawer itself doesn't get covered in glue. So there we go. So there's a reasonable amount of glue on there. I do want it to hold. So I'm going to use my ruler as a bit of an aid as well in this case, because I can't get over the top as I normally would. So I know that that's going to be on that side, about there. And once that's roughly in position, I can just check to see if it looks positioned quite well on all sides. Yeah, and then I can apply that pressure. Now I would advise that even if you can get your drawer out of this sleeve, that you leave it in place, because what can happen is when you're applying pressure on this platform, it can, the glue can adhere slightly further along the edges, and that can diminish the amount of height you've got. So I found that to my cost. So, you know, you've got the benefit of my mistake there. Do try and leave that drawer in place, because it just means that you're not altering the fit in any way. And just apply that pressure. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'll apply double-sided tape onto the top of this section here, and I will apply this by turning it upside down and repeating that process. So there's no point in me going through that a second time with you, so I'll come back to you when that's complete. So that's top and bottom sorted, my drawer working really nicely. It's a good tight fit. And, you know, I'm pleased with that. So that's essentially that little gift box finished. Now, if I wanted to use that on its own, this is the point at which I might decide to embellish it in whatever way. But we're using it as part of our drop-sided wine box. And this is the wine box on this occasion that I'm going to be using. So I've gone with that same colourway. Now, this is also where I can demonstrate what I mentioned to you earlier. I have already made the second drawer here, slightly tighter actually, but still a good fit. So, and actually this card here is quite a thin card, so for that reason I wouldn't really want that to be on the bottom of my wine box. So I've chosen how I'm coordinating this section of the box accordingly, because that will go on the top. So I've got my thicker card to go on the base. So when you're putting this wine box together, if you have a card that has that is a thinner or a lighter weight card, use that for this angled part of your box, and then you're going to have your stronger card on the base that, you know, has a greater capacity for supporting the weight of your wine bottle. So that's that. So the only thing before we get that done, actually, I'm going to deal with the little embellishment that will go on the top of this box, and that will help me not to make a mistake and glue this part of the box the wrong way up on the top of my wine box. So we'll sort that out next. Now, to embellish that top of the box, I'm just using the same embellishment that I've used for the side of the wine box, just to keep everything in line. So let's go back to this original. So that's what we've used on the side, and that's what I'm using on the top. So if you've used that, already viewed that wine box tutorial, you will know that I've used a combination of two die cutters. So this one's a Spellbinders Nestabilities Eyelet circles, and then I've used my PoppyStamps garden bouquet, and I will put the details in the description area for you, so you don't need to worry about taking notes there. So the first advisable thing to do is to ascertain the top of your box and the front of the box, so that's there. And then I can take the first of those embellishments, which is this one that was the Spellbinders Eyelet circles, and I'm not going to bother with any double-sided tape in this instance. I'm just going to use some PVA glue. Had to think about that for a moment, and just make sure that that gets to all these edges before just lining it up. Really, I'm just using my eye in this case, laying it down. I might, being a bit pedantic, we might just have a look. It's about 3/4 of an inch that side. I want to shunt a little bit this way. I'm being pedantic, I realise that. It's a habit. Right, so there we go. That'll do nicely. So that's just going to get some pressure lightly applied. I don't want to press it too much because it is lightly embossed, and if I apply too much pressure, then I'll undo all that embossing work. So then it's just this other little one to actually add an embossed element to that shape. So this is the PoppyStamps one. So I'm just again going to line that up, and I actually know it just and so not quite touches that inner circle, so I've got an idea of where I'm lining it up in that instance. There we are, that's easier. And just applying pressure until that PVA takes some bonding. So there we go. All seems to be in place. So that's effectively that top embellishment done. So we've now got our wine box, our top box, and our bottom box. I'm just checking that's the front. So we do know that's the front. So all we're going to do now is apply the same principle that we did in applying these little platform shapes, but instead of applying the PVA to the drawer, we're going to apply it to the bottom of this box section here. So I'll do this bottom section, and again, a dry run is sometimes helpful, but it is a case when you come to stick these, what you can start to do is just use this part of the box to make sure that it's lining up. It's more important really that when you're viewing this from a little distance away, that this whole pillar effect is forming a line. So let's pop that back. Let's pop some double-sided tape on the bottom here. I'll just do the base one, and then I can do the top box off camera because it's exactly the same principle, and it would be a waste of your time if I went through it, the same process twice. So there we are. check. See, and the other thing is just check. It's worth double checking that you've got the front of your box, because these are quite similar. So make sure you are actually lining all the fronts up, and I like this action to be occurring so that this angled one is on my right. If you're left-handed, it's possible that you prefer it the other way around, but there we go. So I'm just going to put my tape, glue on the bottom there. As usual, a reasonable amount. I don't know why I opened that actually. I don't think I need to. There we go. You just don't want it to be glued to these sides. I think that was what I was aware of. So take that backing tape off there. Right, so that's the front. And I'm going to stick that on here. I'm going to try and do this rather, normally I would drop down so that I've got a visual, but I'm going to try and do this in such a way that you can see it. So lining that up. So actually I think that could go back a bit slightly because that's a better line there. So just checking. I think that may be the best I'm going to get in that case. So once I've got that down, I can then apply some pressure here. But again, just be aware of that jaw below. It shouldn't make any difference now because that's all sorted. So that's great. So that's that sorted, and actually, you know, that's going to take the weight of my wine bottle quite nicely. Let's move that forward a bit for you. So if you wanted, that's basically what it looks like with just one of those boxes on. So, you know, it's a matter of preference really. You could opt to just have one box, and you maybe put another roof section on the top here rather than another box, so that option would be there for you as well. So it's, you know, you can probably take this box further than I have done in this tutorial. So all we're going to do next really is to apply that same principle to fit this box, and I will probably turn the box up the other way so that I am actually following exactly the same method. So I'm going to do that off camera so that I don't waste your time, and then I'll come back to you and we can perhaps take a closer look at this finished box. And unfortunately I haven't got too many colorways for you on this occasion. I've been interrupted with bank holidays and a shorter week, but I have got a black and cream one, which was the prototype that I can show you. So I will come back to you in a few moments. So that's my finished gift box. I've got my little drawer at the top, and I've just put in there a mini distress ink stamp pad and a tiny little mushroom stamp. I've got some chocolates in the bottom, some Elizabeth Shaw chocolates in the bottom there, and I've got my bottle of rosé in the middle. And that's essentially that box completed. So I did say that I would try and show you some other colorways. So we did see this purple one earlier, and that has a similar mechanism. And I did have one more colorway for you, which with this black, it is a prototype. So oops, that jaw doesn't have a stopper, and as you can see, it's the top one that doesn't have the stopper, and that slides right through. It's not quite so important on the top, but this is what showed me that I really did need a stopper. But it's the prototype, and that just shows you how that color combination works. The mechanism is still the same. So there we go. The only other thing, of course, is that if you wanted to use that tutorial in isolation and not worry about the wine, you just wanted a small gift box with a sliding drawer, there you've got that option as well. So that's essentially another tutorial finished. Don't forget that there are tables of card sizes, scoring indications and diagrams coming up in the next few clips for you. There's information in the description area, and other than that, as always, thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you can join me again next week.